There we go. That's why we check before we start. Don't mess up an entire lecture like I've done before. Alright. Any questions before we start today? The syllabus should be up on Blackboard. We'll be finishing this chapter today for sure. We've only got a couple of slides left, and then I'll put this up on Blackboard, and we'll get into the next chapter. In fact, my book is still on where I was in my other class. Okay. So, this should be where we ended. The return to Democrat rule in the South under the Redeemers, who were more about violence and intimidation than, winning hearts and minds, including the use of the Ku Klux Klan, which was to some degree weakened in 1872 with the Joint Committee on Klan Activities, but as we're well aware, it was refounded several times, so it's still around. We'll actually talk about Horace Greeley in just a minute. This image of the book. Yeah, that's Horace Greeley there. It's more for him on the next slide. All right. So, although most of the abolitionists and those fighting for civil rights came from the North, they still held the same beliefs as those in the South when it came to racial discrepancies, I suppose you'd say. The book here specifically, most Northern whites share the racial view of their counterparts in the South. Although they have supported the protection of black civil rights and suffrage, they still believe that African Americans were inferior to whites, and social integration was no more tolerable to them than it was to white Southerners. So, while we've been having strides in making things slightly better, this is when things started to fall apart. So, as we mentioned, Grant won the presidential election in 1868, and while running for his re-election in 1872, there was a degree of Republicans who fought against that. They nominated Horace Greeley of the New York Tribune and worked with the Democratic Party to try to get rid of Grant. His term was full of a lot of corruption within his administration. That's the word I'm looking for. The book doesn't specifically go into exactly what was going on. But the people working under him tended to be taking advantage of their positions in government. I don't know if he did specifically. But as I mentioned to my last class, he was a good general, not a very good politician. He was a bit, he lacked political tact. However, he did use as the book calls it, the bloody flag, this belief that voting against Grant will be tarnishing the lives lost in the war. And also, the Arlington Cemetery had recently been created, which further kept the sacrifices of the soldiers fresh in people's minds. Well, actually, again, there's a lot of images about Horace Greeley, even though he was the dude that tried to run against Grant, and then he lost. The book doesn't even give us, there isn't even because I always show you guys maps of election results, and there isn't one for Greeley versus Grant. Greeley just got his butt kicked, but he was a character. We'll get into that in just a minute. So Grant did win his second term, but in the South, the power that the Republican government held was waning. 1872, Congress removed most of the penalties on Confederate officers, so many of them were able to run for civil office. Because again, like today, you get a felony for, having a substance that's legal in many states now, and therefore no longer allowed to vote. But back then, you could literally go to war with the government and be fine within a few years. 1874, Democrats had control of the South again and began removing troops. I keep smacking my mic. And what really caused a shift was economics. There was a financial panic when the Northern Pacific Railroad collapsed, because railroads were, even modern day, like there was the threat of a rail strike, and it caused government intervention. Back then, it'd be like saying, okay, we're shutting down the interstate. Just all the interstate just is gone now. It cratered the economy, and people who went on strike due to, the collapse of the railroad and not being paid proper wages for their work, which again is where the modern day strike came from. So the railroad system hasn't changed a whole lot. But back then, if you went on strike, it wasn't like you were given any kind of voice. In fact, if you went on strike, there was a good chance that the employers would call in the army to either make you go back to work or make you go to the cemetery. Why is it doing that? And also, we had the issue of, sir, yeah, okay. The 14th Amendment was butchered, essentially. This is when corporations became legal entities that could pour as much money as they wanted to into politics, because that's certainly not done anything bad to the government. And essentially, this amendment that had been meant to give personhood to African Americans was now basically being used for the good of corporations and giving them more power than the average citizen. So, government. This was the thing that I had alluded to before. This was an 1870s meme, if you want to say. What I know about whoever, in this case Horace Greeley, where he's over here, where's my mouse, working with Jefferson Davis, or at least a Jefferson Davis bill. And then over here, the Patriot, Grant is, on the porch there at the White House, which I'm sure is totally how things would work. And he's, slinging mud, literal mudslinging, which I'm glad is still a term today, because there's so many things back then where it's like, this isn't a term we've used in 150 years. Mudslinging's still around. Here we have, down at the bottom, now that the good ship Union has passed through the sea of trouble into peaceful waters, shall the helmsman be tossed overboard? So it's, this Grant helped us get through the war. Not so much as a political candidate, but, he was there. He was the general. But hey, we're past all that, so let's just get rid of the guy that was a major figure in that, rather. There's Horace Greeley again. He stands out. He apparently had a very unique dress about him, as well as always having lots of stuff in his pockets. I don't know who this dude is, but yeah, there's a lot of interesting caricatures back then. I wonder how long his legs actually were, because that is something else. And there he is, pleading with Satan. Satan, don't get thee behind me. Anything to get possession. So, like, literally making a deal with the devil to try to get power. And again, Greeley, like, didn't do very well, needless to say. This is the only time we ever talk about him. But Harper's Weekly had a lot of fun with this guy. So, which I guess, you know, in 100 years, I mean, there will be many caricatures of current political events, but like, what was with these weird people and this random senator from Vermont sitting angrily in a chair? Like, Bernie Sanders didn't really do anything on the national level, but there was a lot about him for some reason, at least for a short period. I guess that things have never changed, as I've said. Things have never changed. Go all the way back to the Greeks, and the humor certainly hasn't changed. So that's all well and good. We don't really talk much more about Grant after his victory in 72. The election of 1876 was what was important. So Rutherford B. Hayes was nominated by the Republicans. He was the Civil War hero, seen as free of corruption of the Grant administration, which, you know, again, that was the big mark against Grant. So Hayes was another war hero, which was good for, you know, the veteran vote, but also not just like one of Grant's lackeys. The Democrats nominated Samuel J. Tilden. He fought corruption in New York, so lots of anti-corruption folks. That's all well and good. However, the election was nasty. Extremely close. It depended on 20 disputed votes. We'll get into what these disputed votes mean here in a second. Technically, Tilden won 51% of the popular vote, but also apparently that doesn't mean anything in American politics. However, there were political battles in Florida, Louisiana, and South Carolina. Essentially, this is how I understand it. Now, what actually happened might be a little bit different, but from what the book says, let's see, Reconstruction political battles in Florida, Louisiana, and South Carolina. The outgoing Republican administration certified Hayes, and the incoming Democratic regime declared Tilden. So this is what confuses me. During a general election, you're not just voting for the president, you're voting for the senators and representatives whose term have come up. And this was the issue, is the people who had been voted out, the Republicans, voted for Hayes. Hayes. And the Democrats who were now being voted in voted for Tilden. And, like, to me, why would the people who are being voted out get a vote? I mean, like, they get a regular vote, going to the polls. But as far as, like, an electoral vote, that doesn't make sense to me. I guess it was never an issue before, but now it is. Also, the Senate was controlled by one party and the House of Representatives by the other, so they could also not, break this tie. So Congress carried a 15-member joint electoral commission, 7 Democrats, 7 Republicans, and 1 independent. Again, the Democrats, Republicans are just going to cancel each other out. So it left it up to the independent. The independent realized what was going to happen and left. He's like, I don't want to be the one that's going to be in trouble for this. So he was replaced by another independent who voted with Republicans. Therefore, Hayes was technically confirmed as president. However, it's not done yet. As we've seen recently, and it's kind of a shame we're having to point to a recent event to make comparisons to this. Congress still had to ratify the decision, which is nominally it's just like, it's a formal process. It's not something that, I don't know, is like as important as actually counting the votes. But this is a thing they had to do. Democrats threatened to filibuster and hold decision to inauguration, which would create a congressional crisis, et cetera, et cetera. They didn't try to kill anybody. Well, we'll get to that in a minute. So we had the Compromise of 1877. Hayes was allowed to go to the White House, like the votes had said. However, he had to promise to elect a Southerner to his cabinet, withdraw troops from the South, and build a transcontinental railroad through the South, which, you know, is like the lifeblood of the economy now. However, while the Republicans guy went to the White House, the Southerners pretty much got everything they wanted anyway. Like, if Tilden had won, they would have just demanded that they get these things out of Tilden anyway. And also, it ended federal protection of the freed people in the South, so now we were back to the states that are treating their black citizens as less than human are now the ones making the laws. Yay. So here's the electoral map. Again, these various territories are not yet states, so they don't get votes. As far as popular vote, again, Tilden technically won. Not by much, though, like 200,000, not even 200,000, 160, 70,000-ish, which ain't a whole lot. I mean, even if all the whoever this was, were to go to this side, it would be not quite there. However, due to the Electoral College and the one person going with Republicans, Hayes won. However, the book doesn't go into detail about quite how bad it almost got. There was a lot of saber rattling of another civil war. Obviously, the KKK was involved because they wanted to have their guy in charge. It was a little bit scary for a while. They did have that compromise, which was certainly better, better than going to war again over this. But it was seen as a defeat. It was seen as stepping on the memory of the Union troops. It says here, in memory of Union heroes died in a useless war. So yeah, it was the election of 1876. While as far as who was involved wasn't a big deal, because I mean, those of you that actually have heard the name Rutherford B. Hayes, what did he actually do as president? Not much. We don't ever talk about him again. But this event was a big deal. All right. So, and again, this is why I never found the Reconstruction all that interesting, because not much actually in the end happens. Like, there's a big push. Yes, those freed from slavery were technically made citizens and they were technically allowed to vote, but there was a lot of exemptions to that. They were not allowed to own land, which of course made it much harder to succeed economically, and, well, that continued well into the 1950s. And while there was federal progression, the Redeemers soon took over and put things back the way they wanted. And really, across the board, it wasn't like the North was some bastion of civil liberties. They were just as racist as the South. They just felt that, well, we actually have some human beings here in the country that are being treated as less than human. Maybe we should give them a little bit, but no more than that. So now slavery, or at least the prohibition of slavery, was now enshrined in the Constitution, except for prisoners, which we'll get more into later. And while, again, the Reconstruction was kind of a half measure, it did change the country as a whole. I mean, it was going to be a painful change, clearly, but it did move things gradually in the right direction. It at least set like a standard of what would not be done anymore. All right. So that is chapter 14. I'll put that up on Blackboard after class. Where's my mouse? Let's see if there's any. All right. So, on to chapter 15. Moving west, 1865 to 1896. Again, like last semester, the chapters aren't completely chronological. I mean, this is happening after the Reconstruction, but a lot of this is still happening during the Reconstruction. So we're just kind of moving geographic locations and gradually going forward, because we're not going to quite hit 1900 for a few chapters yet. Right. So, moving west. A lot of this is introductory with the Native Americans, which we talked about last semester, but I made this PowerPoint before I made the 101 PowerPoints, and for those that didn't have my 101, here's a quick rundown. Everything west of the Mississippi kind of sucked. I've seen it. I've been there, and like from here to the Mississippi, it's, there's forest and mountains and all of that, and then you get on the other side of the Mississippi and it's just flat grassland. Very few trees. Really, until you get to the Rocky Mountains, it's just a whole lot of nothing, and it's a long ways. The natives there had learned how to cultivate the land and the animals for survival, but the small American farmers who had been used to just clearing woodland and making farms could not work with the land there. I mean, today the Midwest is, mostly corn and wheat and all that. But back then it was very difficult to actually work the soil with the tools that they had, which again we'll get more into later. So the Americans heading west instead would have big tracts of land to roam livestock. So, cattle and sheep to a lesser degree. Now, when we look at the West, when we think of the mythos of the Old West, we typically think of individualism, self-sufficiency, people going out there and surviving on their own. But that was rarely the case. The land was typically granted by the federal government for very cheap, so you could go out and settle, because that was what the government wanted, was people to go out and make settlements and expand the reach of the American people by physically being there. Because you can't just be like, oh, well, we're claiming this land and then just not do anything with it. You're just it's a bunch of land you're not going to get any use out of. Also, mining, lumber, and railroad companies were important in giving people jobs, because, again, going out and just like starting a farm wasn't entirely feasible. If you were roaming livestock, you typically had a lot of capital to start with. So for the most part, if you were heading west, you were working as a miner, working in forestry once you get to the mountains. And to get there, they used railroads. So the railroads had a lot of open positions for people to build. Now, a lot of this money actually came from abroad, in particular Europe, and in particular from Europe, Britain. They wanted to have their hands in what the American frontier will become, because if they're putting money into it, then they'll have a stake in whatever money these ventures make. So while this wasn't like British colonialism going in and like taking parts of the country, they were financially involved because they saw that there was a lot of money to be made. So the biggest investment, and the most important by far, was railroads. I mentioned to my class on Thursday that when I did my Technology in America course, the first 3 chapters, if you weren't sure what the answer was, it was probably wood. From the East Coast to the Mississippi, and at least in that particular period, the East Coast to the Appalachians, lots of woodland. We made everything out of wood. We didn't even use like coal. We used charcoal, because you can make charcoal out of wood. And then after chapter 3, 4, 5, and 6, the answer was probably railroads. And while we won't be focusing as much on railroads, they're extremely important. And of course, the biggest and most important railroad was the Transcontinental. Central Pacific, built from west to east from Sacramento, California, using largely Chinese immigrants, while the that was Central Pacific. The Union Pacific Company, built from Council Bluffs, Iowa, westward, and largely used Irish immigrants, because, again, you just pay them much less, or in the case of the Irish, just give them whiskey. They eventually joined at Promontory Point, Utah, May of 1869, which was a whole thing. And now, rather than going west by covered wagon, which would take some 6 to 8 weeks, so, a month and a half to 2 months to go across a whole lot of nothing, it took about 6 days. You take the train, 6 to 7 days. Not as bad. Now, granted, I've taken a train that was about a 2-day journey, and that was tiring, but I can imagine being on a covered wagon for 2 months. That's why many people died. Also, this was just kind of a footnote, well, not specifically a footnote, but this was mentioned at the very end, and I thought that I would mention it. Reading out of the book here, the building of the railroads fostered corruption. Union Pacific promoters created a fake construction company called the Credit Mobilier. There's actually an accent marker with E, so I guess it's Credit, I don't know. Something French. Funneled government bond and contract money into their own pockets. They then bribed congressmen to not investigate their dealings. However, by 1872, Congress did investigate their dealings, and they got in a lot of trouble. So here we have 1850, as much of the states as there were. The book actually shows, what year is that? Am I looking at the wrong? I guess I had a map earlier. Yeah, there's a bit more up here with like Oregon eventually becomes its own thing because they did find some gold and silver up there. But California first because, well, the Spanish had San Francisco, but also gold and silver and whatnot. Also, there'd be a little issue down here with Mexico. We'll get into that later. The Great Plains are not a single, I mean, I say once you get west of the Mississippi, it's just like flat, which is mostly true. Again, my family, we drove from here in South Carolina to Yellowstone National Park. We decided to do that by interstate, which was not the best. But there are different regions within the Great Plains, but it's a lot of land. It's a lot of nothing. Also, and yeah, I still haven't actually replaced this terrible pixelated image, but the railroads are why we have time zones. I'll actually get into that in the notes a little bit later, but I always like to bring it up. I don't remember the exact amount. I think it was like a 15-minute difference. There was a 15-minute difference between New York City and Boston, and they're, both like in this area. And since railroads were at least attempting to run on very strict schedules, they needed to set time zones of their own, have these blocks of time that were largely the same. As you can see, this is different than what we have today. I mean, that's actually followed the railroad as opposed to the state. And pretty quickly, states just went with what the railroads were doing. It's like, oh, this is actually much better. We're going to do that, like, in our cities. Eventually, I think it might be post-World War I, that the federal government actually took this idea. They did, of course, standardize it a little bit better so that it wouldn't be in the middle of a freaking state like that. But eventually the federal government did use the time zones that the railroads had originally created. There is the Transcontinental Railroad. Again, it didn't start in like New York or something. It started here. But there were plenty of lines that led to Council Bluffs, Iowa. This seems shorter, but this is going through the Rockies. So, yeah, and then also the Nevada desert. It was not a great place to be. I believe this is the Irish here digging their way through. There was a lot of dynamite blasting, a lot of creation of tunnels and whatnot. It was a dangerous job. And didn't pay very well. So, needless to say, the plains were not just this big, empty, open expanse that the American governments could move into. Again, we talked about this at the beginning of last semester, but for those of you that weren't here, we had Native Americans for centuries, if not millennia, before the European settlers arrived. And it was not just like a single group. You'll see westerns where it's like, oh, them Indians. It's like, which ones? There's a lot. They had their own languages, customs, religions, cultures. I typically, go with it. They're as different from one another as European countries are. If you say, oh, well, they're just a bunch of Europeans. Like, well, Spanish, Germans, French, your English, they're different. By the end of the Civil War, there was about 350,000 Native Americans west of the Mississippi, where there had once been about 1 million. Also further west, which we'll talk about at the end of the chapter, were descendants of Spanish conquistadors that had been living in the Southwest and in California since before Jamestown ever existed, which is it's weird from a Anglo-Saxon point of view, where it's like, oh yeah, Jamestown was like the first European settlement. It's like, no, it wasn't. It was the first English settlement. Spain had been there. I mean, they'd been in Florida with St. Augustine since even before the folks out west. But there were people living in the west that were descendants of the Spanish long before Jamestown ever was the thing. The natives east of Mississippi had been pushed west during the presidency of Andrew Jackson, which again we talked about at the end of last semester. You guys don't need to know too much about that for this semester, but you know, it happened. Now, it should be mentioned that the differences in the tribes made expanding westward both more difficult and more simple. As I said, the tribes were as different from one another as European nations were. So, like, learning about a tribe and coming to good terms with the tribe isn't necessarily going to help you with the next tribe over the hill. You know, if you made friends with peaceful farmers, like, oh, we're friends of the Indians, and then the nomadic tribe next door that's not so happy about encroachment into their lands, they don't care that you've made a treaty with the farmers over here. In fact, they might be enemies of the farmers, and it doesn't mean anything to them. However, as the policy of the U.S. government went from treaties, which the government tended to break anyway because, well, you know, to gradually just exterminating the tribes, they were unable or unwilling to work together because, again, there was often a language barrier, but also they'd often been fighting one another for far longer than they've been fighting the Americans, again, many times before the Europeans even knew that there was a continent here. Like, it's hard to overlook generational strife just because some new group moves into town. Unfortunately, that new group was going to be a problem for quite some time. That said, though, it also made it harder. Well, it's a double-edged sword. They couldn't work together very effectively, typically. You would occasionally get some groups that would join together. But also it meant that just because the American government conquers one tribe, it doesn't affect the other tribes. It's not like, say, if you're fighting a nation and you like take their capital, usually that's the end of the war. Usually that's it. But in this case, like, destroying one tribe doesn't really affect the others. So they had to do it piecemeal. Also, when it came to land, Native Americans tended to be communal. Again, they're all very different. They all have their own ways of doing things. But if you want to paint with a broad brush, when it came to Native Americans and land compared to Americans and Europeans, you didn't own land. You owned stuff, weapons, tools, horses, you know, your house, your teepee, typically, which, being nomadic, owning a house didn't mean owning land. But yeah, the land belonged to everybody, or in some cases it belonged to nobody. It was land. You lived there, but you didn't own it. The idea of land ownership didn't really make sense. Also, the bison, which we'll talk more about in a minute, but it was like the central figure for many of the nomadic Western tribes. You kill a bison, you've got meat, you've got their leather hide for making stuff, clothes, and, well, shelter. You can make tools and weapons from their bones. The book even mentions that, let's see, I've gotten behind. Here we go. Yeah. Hide, construct teepees, make blankets and clothes, bones, weapons, etc. Even bison dung served a purpose. After it was dried and hardened, buffalo chips became an excellent source of fuel, which is to say, starting fires, because there weren't a lot of trees. There wasn't a lot of wood to burn. But, like, dried buffalo poop burns well. So, whatever works. Here is an extremely high-resolution map of the various tribes. Each colored region doesn't mean a single tribe. It means like a group that were similar enough that they could be put in a group, but there's more than a single tribe. I mean, here you can see there's lots of tribes. But even within each area, there's multiple. Like this one has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 tribes just here, and those are like the major tribes. And then as you move further west, it's even more broken up, and especially along the western coast. Look at all that. I actually also had, for that other class, Alaska, just by itself, is like several hundred tribes. But we don't have to worry about Alaska for a little while. Again, here we have natives hunting bison. And again, those of you that were here last semester, you remember me talking about this, I would assume. But horses are not native to North America. There was a group of horses that were native for a few thousand years, like back at the end of the Ice Age, but they all went extinct. So Native Americans didn't really have access to horses until the Spaniards showed up, and horses did as they do and got out and ran wild, and then the natives would recapture them and use them for all sorts of purposes. But again, you look in a Western and you think, oh yeah, Native Americans and horses, it's just like, it's always been that way, and that's not been the case. They used to have to hunt bison on foot, and that sucked. So yeah, this was a major advancement for the natives, having access to horses. All right. So as the federal government began dealing with Native Americans more closely, because again, with Andrew Jackson, it was just, let's just push them west of the Mississippi and not worry about it anymore. But now American encroachment is continuing to head west. So they treated each tribe as an autonomous nation, which is pretty accurate at least, and recognized the ownership of the land that they were inhabiting. But again, Native Americans didn't really view land ownership as a thing. And also, when a tribe is particularly nomadic, the land they're currently living on is not the only land they're using. Like, they move to an area, they stay there for a little while, a few months maybe, and then they move to another area. That's something we've been dealing with since Europeans arrived in North America. Natives tended to be pretty nomadic. So eventually we had the Treaty of Fort Laramie to designate areas for tribes to keep the whites from encroaching on their lands, and vice versa. So let's just keep everybody separate. Hopefully we won't have to murder each other. However, the gold rush happened, and it wasn't just like California where the gold rush, or where the gold was, and again, silver actually was more abundant, but whatever. Whites tended to just go wherever, and when they went into native lands, they weren't especially welcome and would often end up killing natives because it's how things have been. And the government rarely did anything about it. So, November 29th, 1864. Again, don't worry so much about dates unless I specifically tell you. We're just trying to have a timeline here. 700 Cheyennes and Arapahos gathered at Sand Creek, Colorado. Supposedly, they were under the protection of the American government. But we had Colonel John M. Shivington, and I've got some quotes from Shivington. He was not a great person. They attacked the natives because there was a bunch of natives in one place, and I guess they felt threatened. Excuse me. The natives raised a white flag of surrender because they weren't there to fight. However, Shivington and his boys killed 270 natives, mostly women and children, often by scalping them, which is a bad way to go. Just cut the skin off the top of your head, and you tend to die from blood loss and exposure. It's not a great way. Just getting shot is a lot easier. You just die. There was a congressional investigation called the Act Barbarous, and proceeded to do nothing. However, the natives didn't appreciate this, and it resulted in various wars across the Great Plains. Oftentimes ended with American troops going in and just like wiping out a village. And also the areas that the natives were allowed to be on continued to shrink. Lieutenant Colonel George Custer was one such American official who liked to murder women and children, and ended up getting himself and his boys killed at the Battle of Little Bighorn in Montana. It's often seen as like Custer's last stand and like some big heroic thing. It really wasn't. Like, it was a battle, at least. He wasn't being murdered alongside women and children in like a town or something. It was an actual battle. And there's a mention here at the end of the section. Among the troops that battled the Indians were African Americans known as Buffalo Soldiers, a name given to them by the Indians, but whose origin is unclear. So it was still not equal. They tended to have the worst jobs, cleaning latrines and cooking and doing, that sort of menial work. But it was better than they'd get when it came to sharecropping, as we've talked about. So it was some level of advancement in terms of the lives of those that were there. Obviously, the regiments were segregated because racism, but it was the fact that they could serve at all was a big deal. So here's Shivington, the Reverend John M. Shivington, in fact. Damn any man who sympathizes with Indians. I have come to kill Indians and believe it is right and honorable to use any means under God's heaven to kill Indians. He was not very subtle. Scalps are what I'm after. I long to be wading in gore. And then also, kill and scalp all big and little. He knew they were murdering children, but he didn't care. In fact, it seemed like he was into the idea of it. And then here's Custer's last stand as the image is typically named, rather than, Custer getting what's coming to him. And I do actually have a map of the battle, which were various skirmishes, retreats, and eventually being surrounded at the hill and slaughtered. And also here's Buffalo Soldiers. I really enjoy images from this time period, especially of large groups of people, because they tend to have at least a guy doing this. My favorite one's still like British soldiers in probably Africa, maybe India. So they've got all those like safari pith helmets and big mustaches, and one's doing that. It's very amusing. But that's my 104 course. Right. So, so the natives did have the tactical advantage of, as I've said, not really working together, which doesn't seem like an advantage, but it's harder to just have a decisive victory against the natives when there are a bunch of different groups. The U.S. military, though, was technologically advanced, well organized, and just had lots of soldiers. They gradually overpowered the natives. The natives did occasionally have their victories, as we mentioned with Custer, but for the most part, it was a losing fight. Worse than the military actually fighting the natives was the near destruction of the bison. We just about had the bison go extinct. We've wiped out a lot of native animals here in North America. So with the railroad expanding, settlers heading west, and then all of a sudden people on the East Coast want bison products, the bison were nearly driven extinct. Those that are still around now are typically, I don't think they're endangered, but they are like, they have a protected status. You don't just go out and hunt bison. Eventually, though, folks in the East did start to see what was being done to the Native Americans as maybe a bad thing. Their reservations were shrinking. The treaties that they had signed with the American government tended to be ignored because, again, that's just a thing that tends to happen. So they started pushing for some level of reform in Native American policy. However, this wasn't, hey, we should maybe leave these people the hell alone. It was assimilation. It was destroying their heritage, their culture, which was seen as inferior, and make them good, proper Americans, which was something that was done throughout the 1800s and even the early 1900s, both here in America and in Canada. And recently, we've discovered that these schools that children were sent to after being stolen from their parents often had like mass graves because the people working there didn't really care what happened to their charges, and when they died, they just threw them in a hole. So yeah, technically not as bad as like full-out genocide, but still pretty bad. The major legislative action here was the Dawes Act, where the tribal rules were, tribal rulership, I should say, was abolished. Each family was given a parcel of land to live on, and after 25 years, they'd be made citizens as long as they gave up their cultural and religious practices. However, this wasn't just trying to destroy their heritage. It also was used to make a lot of money for the government, because the land that the natives were given tended to be the not-so-great land, and the land that was really good for farming was taken and sold to prospective settlers. So even the Dawes Act, which was sort of positive, because at least it wasn't like an extermination thing, was still used to screw over the natives. There was one final act of resistance. Prophet Wovoka received a vision that the Native Americans would one day rule over the world, and the ghost dance would make this happen. So natives showed up at Wounded Knee, was Colorado? But he's in Nevada. Where was Wounded Knee? Present-day South Dakota. So while these folks were gathering together and like literally performing a dance they hoped would make the gods like them again, the 7th Cavalry rolled in and murdered a bunch of them. 250 Native Americans, many women and children, because of course it's never just like they had a military engagement with a military force and fought against like warriors or soldiers. It was no, they just straight up shot a bunch of women and children. Just to give you an idea of the like scale of what we're talking about here, here's a pile of bison skulls. And while bison skulls are certainly big, you can see the guy up here. Where'd my mouse go? I mean, it's like up to your knee. That's a lot of skulls. That's a lot of dead bison. These aren't like skeletons. These aren't bodies of bison. These are just the skulls. This was usually how it went down. You'd have folks sitting on the front and sides of trains and just shooting into herds just to thin them out. Here is General Sheridan. We mentioned him briefly last class. By the sweat of thy brow shalt thou eat bread, and you will be happy. A school for savages, or teaching the young idea not to shoot. Says big engine, white man, hold on, we want to big talkie. General Sheridan says, no, I'll whip you first, then we can talk. So, yeah, Harper's Weekly again on the ground floor with this stuff. Here's this horrifying image from 2012 of the Dawes Act. If you've ever seen The Langoliers, which, not a very good Stephen King movie, but kind of that. Yes, the Dawes Act, carving up the land and giving the good land to the Americans and the not so good land to the natives. And then of course we have Wounded Knee, which is just pictures of fields strewn with bodies. And then they just dumped them in a hole. Because I mean, why dig separate graves? So, we do still have 10 minutes left. However, this is where I ended it on Thursday because I didn't want to get too far ahead of this class. And the next is mining stuff, and that's a whole separate section, so we'll end here. You guys, I usually try not to run us to 9:45, but no, we'll stop here. We'll talk about the mining frontier. I'll get chapter 14 up on Blackboard. Well, I say after class, probably after my next class. But yeah,